What happens when a flight attendant questions a quiet man's right to wear a simple cross around his neck, without realizing that man is Keanu Reeves? What began as a subtle moment of judgment over a silver crucifix would soon escalate into something far more profound. By the time the plane landed, no one on board would forget what he said, or how he said it. But before we take off, tell us, where are you reading this from? We love seeing your reactions. The encounter begins the main hall of Los Angeles International Airport, buzzed with its usual chaos. Travelers rushed in every direction, children tugged along colorful rolling bags, and business executives frantically typed on their phones while stealing glances at the flight boards. In the midst of it all, one man moved differently. Steady, unhurried, unbothered. Dressed in a plain black t-shirt, worn-out jeans, and scuffed sneakers, he carried no designer labels, no flashy accessories, and had no security detail clearing a path. It was Keanu Reeves. A few people cast curious glances his way, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. Could it be? But most didn't recognize him. He passed through the crowd like any other traveler, perhaps even someone who seemed slightly out of place in such a polished environment. Yet, one detail set him apart. Hanging loosely around his neck, a small silver crucifix caught the airport lights. It wasn't extravagant, wasn't polished to perfection, but it had weight, not in size, but in meaning. Keanu moved forward, not seeking attention, not concealing himself, simply existing. The moment of doubt at the first-class gate, he stepped into the priority line and handed his ticket to the flight attendant on duty. She was polished, her uniform crisp, her posture practiced. She glanced at the boarding pass, then at him. Sir," she hesitated, brow furrowing. "I think you might be in the wrong line. This is for first class." Keanu's expression remained calm, unbothered. He offered a small smile. "I'm in the right place." Her name tag read Carla. She glanced at the ticket again, verifying his name. It was real, and now recognition flickered in her eyes. Of course, she knew who Keanu Reeves was, but something about him threw her off. The casual outfit, the scuffed sneakers, the complete absence of that celebrity aura she was used to in first class. Even after confirming his identity, she hesitated. A silent bias had already surfaced. She let him pass, but something about him made her uneasy. As he walked down the corridor, settling into his first-class seat with practiced ease, Carla kept watching. Something was off. Was it the stark simplicity where she expected extravagance, or was it the crucifix? As Keanu adjusted his seatbelt, the necklace shifted fully into view, and that's when she froze. Her eyes locked onto the small silver cross, and a flicker of tension crossed her face. She didn't say a word, but she took a step forward, then another. Her movements were firm, deliberate, almost rehearsed. Something had shifted inside her. The tension in the air, the aircraft hummed softly as it climbed into the sky, leaving the world below a blur of rooftops and cloud. Inside the first-class cabin, the air was crisp, the lights dimmed just enough to suggest relaxation. Keanu sat still, arms resting lightly on the armrests. He wasn't reading, wasn't watching a movie, just being. The quiet presence of a man who needed no noise to command attention. And yet Carla couldn't look away. From the galley, she peeked into the aisle, keeping him in sight. There was something about the way he sat there, calm, centered, completely himself. It unsettled her. She had served celebrities before, the loud ones, the entitled ones, the ones who demanded attention. Keanu wasn't any of those. Yet something about him, or perhaps about that necklace, unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite name. Finally, she made up her mind. With professional poise, she approached. "Sir," she began, lowering her voice slightly, "I'd like to remind you that we have certain policies regarding overt religious symbols in shared spaces. Especially in this cabin, we ask for discretion." Keanu turned to her slowly, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said, voice calm but firm. "Have I broken a rule?" Carla's voice remained polite, but there was an edge now. It's not about rules. It's about maintaining a neutral environment. Some passengers might find certain symbols divisive. Keanu glanced down at the crucifix resting against his chest. "I've flown like this many times before," he said. "No one's ever had an issue." Carla hesitated. This wasn't the reaction she expected. "Yes, well, times are changing," she replied. "Some travelers are more sensitive these days. We just ask that everyone be considerate. Perhaps you could..." She gestured vaguely, unwilling to point directly at the necklace, as if the symbol itself might burn her fingers. Tuck it in? Keanu didn't get angry, but he also didn't comply. His next words would leave the entire cabin silent. And by the time they landed, no one on that plane would forget them. The weight of a simple cross, it's not a fashion statement. It's not a provocation. It's part of who I am. Keanu's voice was steady, unshaken. Carla forced a smile, the kind designed to diffuse rather than connect. Of course, she said smoothly, and we respect that. We simply ask that passengers keep personal expressions discreet, especially in premium cabins. Her tone was professional, but there was a sharpness beneath the words. A passive-aggressive bite, dressed in policy. A woman across the aisle subtly glanced up, her interest piqued. A man 2 rows back removed an earbud. The air had shifted. Not loud, not chaotic, but palpable. Sainu remained composed. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. With all respect, he said, as I believe I'm being singled out. Carla blinked. Excuse me, if someone else wore a pendant, a tree, a star, a stone, would you ask them to hide it? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Reset. That's not what this is about, she said. Then what is it about? She said. Then what is it about? Silence. She didn't answer. Instead, she cleared her throat, stepped back, and gave a curt nod. I'll give you a moment. Keanu exhaled slowly, looking up at her now with a quiet intensity. Oh, this necklace, he said. This necked my life more than once, in war zones, in a hospital room wake from. His voice didn't rise, but it filled the space like thunder in a cathedral. I won't hide it. Not now. Not ever. For the first time, Carla's carefully constructed mask cracked. A flicker, frustration, disbelief. It was barely there, but everyone saw it. Passengers shifted in their seats. The energy in the cabin was different now. No longer uncertain. People were forming silent opinions. A man lifted his phone, angling the camera discreetly toward the aisle. Another leaned to his partner and whispered, Is that really Keanu Reeves? But Keanu wasn't trying to make a scene. He was simply standing still, holding a boundary others thought soft. Carla, sensing control slipping through her fingers, straightened. If you refuse, she said, her voice tightening, I'll have to escalate this to the captain. Keanu met her gaze, calm, resolute. You do what you need to do, he said. But understand this. His eyes locked onto hers, steady as stone. The problem isn't what's on my chest. It's what's in your eyes. A silence so deep fell over the cabin it might as well have been outer space. Even Carla took half a step back. Even she felt it, not just the weight of his words, the truth in them. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. She had nothing to say, and everyone knew it. The shift the plane had reached cruising altitude. Outside, clouds drifted lazily beneath the wings. Inside, the first-class cabin remained a sanctuary of quiet luxury, reclining seats, champagne flutes, the occasional clink of silverware. But in one corner, an entirely different kind of energy buzzed. The aftershock of a confrontation no one had expected to witness. Keanu sat still, his expression unreadable. The crucifix still rested against his chest, still visible, still unchanged. Carla returned from the galley. Her steps were quicker now, more rigid. She stopped beside his seat, lips pressed into a thin line. Her voice was neutral, but this time there was no disguising the tension beneath it. Sir, she said, I've received comments from other passengers. Some are feeling uneasy. Keanu turned to her. Calm. Uneasy about what? Carla hesitated. The answer was obvious, but she seemed reluctant to say it aloud. About the display of ideological symbols in a shared enclosed environment, she finally said, We strive to maintain a space where everyone feels comfortable. Keanu didn't blink. A symbol of faith makes people uncomfortable. Carla inhaled sharply. Imagine if everyone began wearing political pins, religious signs, ideological slogans. It would create division in a space meant for unity. Keanu leaned forward slightly. His voice was still quiet, but now it carried weight, a deliberate clarity. Then maybe, he said, the problem isn't the symbol. Maybe it's what people have been taught to feel about it. His words landed heavier than his voice. A couple nearby exchanged glances. The man subtly angled his phone, pressing record. Carla noticed. Her posture straightened as if she could regain control through sheer stature. I'm simply following protocol, she said, though the words felt thinner now. If you refuse to cooperate, I may have to notify security. That got attention. More heads turned. A quiet hush spread through the cabin, the kind that comes when something real, something raw, pierces through the surface of routine. Keanu didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't move. He simply met her gaze and said, "Call whoever you need to. But know this, the problem isn't what's on my chest. It's what's in your eyes." Silence, total. Carla stared at him, for the first time really seeing him. And in that moment she realized he wasn't angry. He wasn't even challenging her. He was holding up a mirror, not with judgment, with clarity, and that made it even harder to swallow. Flight attendant further back paused mid-task. The couple continued filming. A few passengers subtly nodded, though they remained silent. The divide wasn't forming between faiths or ideologies. It was forming between perception and reality. Carla took a step back. Jaw clenched. She didn't know it yet, but the tide had begun to turn. The turning point, Carla stood stiffly at the back of the aircraft, hidden behind the galley curtain. Her phone vibrated, then again. She didn't check it. She already knew what the messages were. Questions from her team, updates from corporate, maybe even a warning. The cabin lights had dimmed to their soft evening glow, but there was no rest for her now. Her uniform still felt too tight. Not because of heat, because of what had just happened. She exhaled, steadying herself, trying to recall training, protocol, anything that could reset the situation. But no amount of airline regulations could change one simple fact. She had tried to wield authority, and instead, she had revealed control slipping. Back at row 3, Captain Morales hadn't moved yet. He stood in the aisle, hands still behind his back, his presence carrying the quiet weight of a seasoned leader. Keanu, too, had not moved. The silver crucifix rested against his chest unchanged, unbothered. And yet everything around them had shifted. All passengers were no longer just observing, they were invested. A woman in 4A, who had barely looked up from her tablet earlier, was now watching intently. The man who had been recording still had his phone angled just enough to capture the moment without drawing attention. Even the flight attendants at the front of the plane were lingering just a second longer than necessary as they refilled drinks, their ears tuned to what was unfolding. Carla had spoken, Nicole had spoken, Keanu had spoken, but now everyone was waiting for Captain Morales. The pilot finally exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw before turning back to Carla. His voice remained level, but there was a new edge to it now. Did he say anything disrespectful? Carla hesitated, opened her mouth, but words didn't come, so she pressed her lips together instead. Captain Morales turned to Nicole. "Anything aggressive?" Nicole swallowed, shifting slightly. "No, sir." Morales let the silence settle before finally nodding. Then, in a voice both calm and absolute, he said, "Then I see no violation." A beat, then another. The air inside the first-class cabin felt heavier now, not from conflict, but from a moment taking shape. Nicole exhaled softly. The man recording gave the faintest hint of a smile. Even Keanu, who had remained still and composed through it all, tilted his head slightly, as if quietly acknowledging a shift in the tide. Carla, however, stood frozen. This was not how it was supposed to go. She had expected compliance, or at the very least, resistance that justified escalation. Instead, what she had encountered was something far worse. A mirror, a reflection of a policy wielded without thought, a rule enforced without reason, a battle picked without understanding. And now, the weight of that misstep was public. The murmurs began softly rippling through the rows, passengers exchanging glances, small, quiet nods, a shift in the room that couldn't be undone. Morales turned to Keanu. "I appreciate your patience, Mr. Reeves." A genuine statement. Keanu nodded once. "And I appreciate yours." A simple exchange, but not a small one. Captain Morales took one last glance at Carla, not unkind but measured, before stepping back toward the cockpit. Carla swallowed, jaw tight. She wanted to say something, anything. But for the first time since this began, she had nothing left to stand on, and everyone knew it, including herself. Later, when the lights were lower somewhere over the Atlantic, long past the confrontation, the cabin had settled again. Champagne flutes refilled, seatbelt signs flickering on and off, passengers dozing or staring out at the endless stretch of dark sky. But Carla didn't sit. She stood at the back of the plane, hidden by the galley curtain, the soft hum of the engines pressing in around her. Her fingers hovered over her phone. The messages were piling up. She finally clicked one open, a text from a number labeled Operations HQ. "Call us upon landing." Her stomach tightened, not because she feared punishment, but because for the first time, maybe in her entire career, she was questioning whether she had enforced a policy that should never have been enforced at all. And that was something no training manual had prepared her for. She inhaled deeply, closing her eyes for just a second. Then, with a set jaw and a lingering thought she wasn't ready to say aloud, she swiped the screen off and let the silence of 40,000 feet swallow her whole. The aftermath, the video Carla recorded that day, wasn't meant to go viral. She had spoken quietly, honestly, not for attention, not for redemption, but because the truth had finally settled in her chest and she needed to say it out loud. And yet, within hours, it was everywhere. Articles dissected her transformation. Comment sections flooded with debates, praise, and inevitable cynicism. Some called it performative. Others called it brave. But Carla didn't read the comments. She had already made peace with what mattered. Somewhere in Los Angeles, Keanu sat at a quiet cafe, sunglasses low on his nose, stirring a cup of coffee. His phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "Carla, I never got to say thank you. Not just for the cross, but for the moment you didn't push. The moment you let me see myself." A small smile touched his lips. He typed back 2 simple words. "Keanu, always grace." Then, slipping his phone into his pocket, he picked up his cup, took a sip, and let the world keep turning. Because for him, nothing had ever really changed. Only the people around him had.